Coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Correllian Tradition. And this is Midday with Rev Don. Welcome, it's good to see you. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Rev Don, you can type your comments or questions into whatever platform you happen to be watching on, and they will appear here in my chat room, and we can discuss whatever you would like to discuss. In addition to our topic for today, and our topic for today is a continuation of our topic this week, which was the spiritual contributions of various Correllian ancestors, specifically the first priestesses of the tradition. Today we're going to talk about Lady Krystel, who is not yet an ancestor, but like myself, kind of has one foot in both worlds, and we're going to talk about her contributions to this tradition. But before we do that, I also wanted to talk about another subject that has come across the my table, so to speak, and this is this was on Sir Edward's page, and it was the statement: I accept that a witch has the right to learn anything they want, whenever they want, and that witches have a right to all knowledge. And I thought I would give you my opinion on this. You can already see my opinion if you're following my Facebook page, because I shared it there. And my view is that knowledge is everything. If you were to ask me, really the biggest thing that I have stood for in life, I think it is to gain knowledge, to grow knowledge, and to share knowledge. Everything from the standardized version of the Correllian training materials to my work with Witch School, my work in the publishing world, it's all about knowledge. And hello to Mary in the chat room. Good to see you, Mary. And I think that the more you know, the better off you are. And I think that to deliberately limit your own knowledge is a very bad thing. Now, of course, it is understood that while anyone might want to know everything, there is so much to be known that we must make choices of what we know. But to keep yourself deliberately ignorant, I think, is a horrible thing. To limit your knowledge, to compartmentalize your knowledge so much that you denature it. These are not aspects of being a witch. Witchcraft is, we often translate the idea of the witch as the craft of the wise. Limiting knowledge has no connection to wisdom. So I've often said that I disagree with that advice that many people give to people who are new to the community, to go read everything they can, but instead to go meet the community. Because sometimes those things you read are not going to reflect what you actually find. In saying that, I don't mean that you shouldn't go ahead and read those things later, but to understand the community, you meet the community, but that is also knowledge. Mary says she loves this color on me. Thank you, Mary, and hello to Lynn. I like this color too. This shirt was a gift from the Right Reverend Sir Laurie Blackman, and I'm quite fond of it. But coming back to knowledge, I think the more you know, the better off you're going to be. And granted, not all knowledge that you may find in the world is going to be of equal caliber, but you'll never know that if you don't find it. You'll never know that the stories that you find in tabloids are generally not true if you're not looking at anything else. So I think the worst thing you can do is say, I'll only learn from this one source, because then you're completely dependent on the veracity of that one source. Whereas if you can learn from many, you may find, well, what you will find is there are almost always multiple opinions on most things, including the things that most people agree with. There are always going to be some who don't. And it's worth knowing that too. I've often been described as a bit of a walking encyclopedia. I could talk on almost all subjects, um, with perhaps the exception of things like chemistry and advanced mathematics, which were not in my particular wheelhouse, but history, the arts, literature, cinema, um, many forms of craft and handicraft, obviously magic, um, a wide range of things, language. I mean, how many times have I talked about language on this show? And this is because my attitude has always been that you never stop learning. Even now, I'm constantly learning. At what I acknowledge to be the latter portion of my lifetime. And I hope that continues until the very last day. And I see people on this question commenting on what people shouldn't learn or shouldn't be allowed to learn. And, I'm just unimpressed with that attitude. I saw one person saying they'd rather die than reveal the secrets of their family. Well, that means those secrets are likely to die with you. I had that same choice, as did Lady Krystel and other members of my family. We definitely did not make that choice. And if you look at history, how many secrets did die with the one or relatively few people who held them? I'm not a great believer in the idea that the human race has forgotten vast amounts of knowledge, but we certainly have forgotten certain things. We've learned through archaeology that we invented aluminum repeatedly in history and never passed it down. It died after, in various places, 1 to 3 generations because it was kept a secret. Secrecy is the path to death. It is the path to the loss of knowledge. I do not favor it. And if you ever find yourself wondering what I stand for, it is the sharing of knowledge freely and as far as possible. And someone's not ready for the knowledge, well, they're not going to understand it anyway. And who are you to say whether they're ready or not in the end? And Mary says, thank you for not making that your choice. I have learned so much from you in the tradition. And thank you, Mary. I'm glad to hear that. Because you know what, and as I find myself now dealing with deteriorating health and being over the age of 60, I often ask myself, did I do the right things in my life? I certainly made plenty of mistakes, but I think that overall, I think the answer is yes. Hello to Renee in the chat room. Would I do anything differently? I might if I could go back, which maybe I can, with the knowledge of how to do it differently. But do I regret the choices that I made? Certainly not the conscious ones. Certainly not passing on knowledge. Knowledge, I think, is the key to the universe. It's the key to wisdom. Now, today we wanted to talk about Lady Krystel and what she has brought to the Correllian tradition. Speaking of Lady Krystel, one of the stories I often tell about her is that when I had my 3rd degree initiation, her advice was to remember that it was not an ending, but a beginning to learning. And I think that's always been the Correllian point of view. It certainly is my point of view, as I've just been explaining. And as I say, I've always been a believer in continuing to learn. And Lady Krystel's example was part of that. The example of these other people we've been talking about was part of that. But with Lady Krystel, I would have to say that probably her biggest contribution to contemporary Correllianism, and hello to Magical Mermaid in the chat room, probably is developing further attitudes on things like probable lives, parallel incarnations, the idea of the multiverse and multiple timelines. Lady Krystel, I was speaking yesterday about how Lady Mabel was influenced by people like Alice Bailey, the Theosophists, and others who were popular in her day. Lady Krystel was very heavily influenced by Edgar Casey, but also by Jane Roberts and Seth. And hello to Brian in the chat room. And Lady Krystel brought a lot of that attitude, that we live many variations of our lives, not just the one we're consciously aware of. The idea that the soul makes incarnational choices the consciousness does not see, that it makes multiple timelines of a single life. Now, some of this Lady Mabel already was teaching. Some may even go back to Caroline. But Krystel really focused very heavily on it. And if you read, not our first degree lessons so much, not our second degree lessons so much, but if you read the third degree lessons, you'll see a lot of that effect in what we teach at the higher levels. And I have also done a lot of work with that. But, you know, I think for myself, that sharing of knowledge, that aspect of teaching, was probably one of my biggest things that I brought. Certainly the systemization of our processes. And in systemizing them, I absolutely did not intend that what was not in that basic system was not desirable, only that there should be a basic system to start from. And Lady Krystel really did introduce me to these very advanced ideas at a very early age. And I've talked about how when she first started talking about things like probable lives, and if you're not familiar what's meant by that, a probable lifetime is another variation on this same one that you're living. We talked about this the other day under Lady Mabel, but there is the idea that many times in life when we have major decisions, our timeline splits as our soul tries both paths. Some people think that's with every decision. I don't agree with that point of view. I think it's only major ones. But I do think that most every life will have multiple timeline splits, unless it ends very, very early, because there are always going to be major choices that the soul wants to see from multiple angles. And those timelines don't know about each other for the most part. If you're a high-level practitioner, you may see into them. You may be able to interact with them, but most people don't, at least not consciously. The things we do unconsciously are myriad, but consciously we don't normally see this. A parallel lifetime, on the other hand, is a different life that your soul is leading. You know, I've talked about how in the years that I was learning and being trained, and even afterwards, because Lady Krystel and I worked very closely our whole lives, but in the time I was being trained, when talking about parallel lifetimes, she spoke about one that she had dreamed of and experienced through meditation, in which she was a red-haired artist. And there's a lot more description of that. I'm not going to go into it. Hello to Lavola in the chat room. Good to see you. But some years later, I was at an event and I happened to meet a red-haired artist who strongly reminded me of Lady Krystel. Her art reminded me strongly of things that Lady Krystel did, things that she liked. And after meditating on it, I came to the belief that I had met this parallel incarnation of Lady Krystel's soul. And now, if you have followed the higher Correllian teachings, hello to Michael in the chat room. Good to see you, Michael. You may also be aware of the idea that Lady Krystel and I believe that we are also probable incarnations, not probable, but parallel incarnations of the same soul. But that doesn't mean that the artist is coming from my side. I think it came from her side. On my side, I was the artist. But that's an example of a parallel incarnation. I've met a number that I believe are parallel incarnations of myself. And some of them, and I believe one of the reasons that I was aware of meeting several of them is that I was studying this subject. And I asked Spirit to show me, and Spirit did. Some of them had a lot in common. Some had nothing, well, very little in common. At least one, both looked so much like me that they could be mistaken for me in a picture, and sounded so much like me that we were mistaken on the phone, but had a very different life. And so I'm a great believer in these things, but the deeper teachings about this come from Lady Krystel. That's what she brought to the tradition. The idea that we can move from one timeline to another comes more from Lady Mabel, but Lady Krystel, again, developed from that idea more and deeper concepts. The idea that we would have probable versions of this life does go back farther, at least to Mabel, but Krystel really focused on it. And those, I think, are some of the major things she brought to the Correllian tradition. Another thing she brought to the tradition, and I can't say it originates with her. I think it was true for all of them. But in my life, in my teaching, I got it from her particularly, and watching how she did things. And that was, she didn't worry about the small stuff. And my advice to you is don't worry about the small stuff. If you're in a ritual and someone calls the wrong quarter, well, they know who they are. Now, Lynn in the chat room says, I remember as a young child being introduced to parallel time by the Gothic soap opera Dark Shadows. Yes. I don't know if Dark Shadows was an influence on Lady Krystel or not. I'd have to ask her. But yeah, that they worked with that subject. The Planet of the Apes movies was my first introduction to the idea of multiple timelines. And the way they explained it is still, I think, the best way. They described time as being like a multi-lane highway. Each lane in that highway is a timeline. And they don't cross over each other, but they run next to each other. And under the right circumstances, you can move to the one next to you or move across several. And I believe that very much to be true. I believe that I've done that on occasion. And I believe most of us do unconsciously do it. Learning to do it consciously is a whole other matter. We talk about this in the third degree lessons. We actually give instructions for it. And I was saying earlier, I don't believe in holding back knowledge. So everything that you need to know is there. But it's also phrased in such a way that you may need to look at it more than once. Because I do consider that also to be consciously messing with your timeline to be one of the more advanced things that you can do. And I don't recommend doing it until you have a pretty good grounding of what you're doing. And I wrote the instructions with that in mind. But not because I don't believe in sharing the knowledge. But talking again about this idea of not sweating the small stuff, one of the things, and I don't think I've told this story in this half hour, but I've told it many times, when we first started talking when I was training about things like parallel lifetimes and uh, parallel incarnations, probable lifetimes, multiple timelines, I didn't get it. And I was probably about 14, actually. No, probably 15 when we were dealing with that. Um, but yeah, I didn't get it. And Lady Krystel had the wisdom to say, "Okay, let's not worry about it." Wisest words I think I've ever gotten from a teacher or heard from a teacher. Her verdict was, "We're not going to worry about this now. We're going to come back to it later." And 6 months later, we came back to this same subject, and I had no trouble understanding it. Because in the meantime, one, my consciousness had expanded, and two, we had looked at this subject without naming it. We'd looked at the foundational blocks of it from a number of angles. So by the time we came back to it, it was no longer an issue. I've known a lot of people who think of themselves as great teachers who, if their student couldn't handle the thing when they tried to give it to them, would have given up on the student. I think that is a terrible way to be a teacher. Um, you come back to it when you can. You deal with things. Well, we always said at Witch School, deal with it at your own pace. We say right in the lessons, you're going to get from these what you put into them. And don't be afraid to come back to them later. One of the things many people have told me is that they often go back and reread the lessons at certain timelines because they find, or at certain periods in time, because they find they get more out of them they didn't get the first time, because they are written in a very layered manner. And that idea of not having to force everything at the first try, in some ways, comes from Lady Krystel. It also came from Leveda, from Mabel, but it was Krystel who really impressed it on me. And well, I guess they all did. But for Krystel, it was a major thing. I think that everybody learns differently, but everybody learns. And one system that cannot change is never going to work for everybody. It can't. It just isn't how people are. So you have to be prepared to make variations when they're needed. Oh, and hello to the Right Reverend Sir Laurie in the chat room. And she says, I still do reread the lessons. Wonderful. Wonderful. And as you can see, I'm wearing your blue shirt. That idea that, I remember when I was young, I was a great fan of Masterpiece Theater. And when we say young, we're talking, preteen. But I remember Alester Cook, who was the host, at least in the US version of this show, making a comment about the Edwardians and that their attitude toward sexuality in particular was that all of these things existed and people did them, but you don't run out in the street and frighten the horses with them. I think that is very wise advice in a sense, and has very much to do with how I put those lessons together, how Krystel taught me, how my mother taught me. Just because something's there doesn't mean that you have to be blunt about it or that it must be understood the first time you encounter it. You can come back to it. And if you try to force it too fast, sometimes that will prevent people from being able to get it. One of the things that I've often encountered with students is when I wrote the lessons, I focused heavily on visualization because I'm a very visual person. I'm a visual artist. I was saying the other day, I've always known how to visualize. In fact, I was well into my pagan career and well into adulthood before I found out that not everybody could. In fact, I think I would go so far as to say I'd written the first degree without realizing that not everyone could visualize. And so it used that word very heavily in that first version. Um, and one of the things I found is that that was a problem for a lot of people. And the answer I gave them is, don't worry about it. Can you feel the energy? That's all that matters. Um, and even if when you begin you don't feel it, work with the exercise. You'll find that you do. Whether you see it visually or feel it energetically, it doesn't matter. In fact, if you can feel it energetically, it's arguably a more advanced ability, um, depending on how you choose to look at it. And so my attitude was that this should never stop someone. And that's my attitude toward everything. Don't let anything stop you from learning. You may have to find your own way to do it. We've worked with students who had test anxiety, and they had to do their tests in unusual ways. I can think of one student whose mentor gave them their tests in conversational form. And that worked for them. They could answer everything um, and do everything that was required of them in that form. But when it was presented to them in less personal forms, it didn't work for them. So I think that we must be very fluid and very adaptive. And Lori says, always the best advice, Uncle Don. Thank you. I appreciate that. Lavola says, do the timelines also include reincarnation? Yes, they must. But I think part of what happens when the soul divides itself that way, the first division is still the same soul, but it goes on as basically a new line of soul within the spirit, or a new line of spirit within the soul, however you want to say it. English words are not always helpful, but it becomes a new line of incarnation within the soul. It will not necessarily go where other versions of that life go, because its experiences will be different. And this is true for a lot of things. We talked about the soul splitting, I think, on Wednesday. Hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. We talked about the soul splitting, and this happens in many different ways. And once it's split, it doesn't come back together. It goes forward in its own line. So yes, it does include incarnation, and as a separate line, at least depending on how big a split you have. Now, sometimes it may not be that big a split. I don't know what to say for that. This is one of those things where we probably could use more research in the future. Because for the most part, if we go back 100 years, nobody was thinking about this. A lot of the work with things like this is late 19th and 20th century work, to the best of my knowledge, although I could be wrong in that, because I certainly don't claim to have universal knowledge, though I certainly would have loved to. But for the most part, these are fairly modern ideas where we've been expanding our understanding of the universe. And so we're still working on some of these questions. I often talk about chronomagic, working with time magic, as being a developing field. There are people who do it. Some do it extremely well. But the knowledge about it is still quite limited. And that's because it's as a conscious practice, a fairly recent thing. More will be understood about it as we go. But one of the things happening in our world right now is that a lot of our understanding of how the physical world is constructed is um, um, that a lot of our ideas, particularly Newtonian physics, have been shown to have been too limited, have not have been displaced by new ideas, and that's going to happen with everything. We will always be discovering more. We will always be advancing our ideas, or at least we should, if we have any common sense. Because the worst thing you can do, I was listening with Sir Edward to a podcast the other day talking about higher education. And the commenter was talking about how you can choose to adapt to the new things that are happening in society, or you cannot. But they're connected. There are consequences to this, including finding yourself unable to do things. I meet lots of people who don't want to learn new ideas, but in 25 to 50 years, or maybe much sooner than that, that only means they're going to be pretty useless when it comes to doing anything that deals with those technologies. There are still people who make brooms by hand, but not very many of them. They don't do very well with it for the most part, unless they're specifically in metaphysics. New ways of making brooms came about and displaced the old technology. If you go to the store and you buy a broom with corn straw bristles on it, or more modern equivalents to that, that's not an old technology. That's the new technology for making brooms. And again, except in certain metaphysical and craft circles where there's a desire sometimes for an older type of broom, you don't see the older types that were basically made from twigs. You only see the new types. Technology changes and it displaces old technology. And the truth is, once the genie is out of the bottle, it doesn't go back in. At least not if it's far enough out of the bottle. So with that, we have talked about, we've talked a lot about knowledge. We've talked about Lady Krystel. I hope that you found this an interesting program. And I thank you for being here. I love you all. I love spending this time with you. And let us close with our prayer, as we normally do. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives. And we ask you to help us to learn all that we can know and all that we wish to know. Help us to learn the things we need to know and to apply them where we need to apply them. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks. May you be blessed now and always. And I thank you with great thanks for being here. I'll see you Monday. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.